Hello everyone. In today's class, we are going to discuss about one more last topic from the respiration in plants, that is amphibolic pathway. For this amphibolic pathway, they had given one flow chart here. This gives a complete information about amphibolic pathway. Then, what do you mean by the word amphibolic? Here, amphi means dual, or it shows the two characteristics, and here pathway is nothing but what? Sequential chemical reactions. That sequential steps of the chemical reactions are commonly named as what? Pathway. You mean here the respiration process is a sequential chemical reaction, and that respiration process is basically amphibolic pathway, because the respiration process has two characteristics. Okay, then what are those two characteristics? Why it is called amphibolic pathway? For this we should have to understand this flow chart. So here they had given three metabolites. One is fat, another one is carbohydrate, another one is proteins. Okay, all these three metabolites are always undergoes a respiratory pathway to release the energy. Okay, so here first initially we can take an example of one metabolite that enters the respiratory pathway for release of what? Energy. Here carbohydrate directly enters the respiratory pathway in the form of glucose. Glucose is converted into glucose 6-phosphate with the help of an enzyme that is called hexokinase, and this glucose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. This kind of reaction is commonly called isomerization, and this fructose 1,6-bisphosphate converted into or splits into two. One is dihydroxyacetone phosphate, another one is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and these molecules are converted into pyruvic acid, and this pyruvic acid finally entered the Krebs cycle with the help of a coenzyme. That enzyme is named as what? Acetyl coenzyme A, and this Krebs cycle yields what? Energy intermediate compounds, and those energy intermediate compounds will enter into where? ETS, as we know, and as we already discussed these things in the last class only. So this is about what? Respiratory pathway of carbohydrate. Okay, in this respiratory pathway of carbohydrate, here the glucose is getting broken down. Okay, the respiration is basically involves what? Breaking of the complex substances and converted into what? Simpler ones. Okay, so this is called respiratory pathway. Similarly, the fat can also enter the respiratory pathway, but fats as well as proteins can never directly enters the respiratory pathway, because before entering to the respiratory pathway, fat should have to converted into fatty acids and glycerols, or fats need to be broken down, fatty acids and glycerols, then it can enter into where? A respiratory pathway. Here they had given the flow arrow mark here. Here glycerol is entered into the respiratory pathway in the form of dihydroxyacetone phosphate, then into pyruvic acid, then into Krebs cycle. Okay, but whereas fatty acids can directly enters the respiratory pathway in the form of what? Acetyl coenzyme A. So this is about fat metabolite, and come to the one more metabolite, that is about what? Proteins. Here proteins can also be broken down, needs to be broken down initially to enter the respiratory pathway into what? Amino acids. These amino acids are nothing but what? Building blocks of proteins. Okay, and these amino acids are later entered into where? The respiratory pathway in the form of pyruvic acid. As we discussed about these things, all the metabolites must enter into the respiratory pathway to release the energy, but glucose can directly enter the respiratory pathway without any conversion, but whereas fats as well as proteins should have to convert fatty acids and glycerol and amino acids. Okay, you must have to remember this. And for this we can say that glucose is the most favored substrate of the respiration process, because it directly enters the respiratory pathway. So in this flow chart, they had given all the metabolites which enters the respiratory pathway to release the energy. Okay, Whatever the metabolites which enters into the respiratory pathway, the respiration process will always breaks the complex food substances into simpler ones. Okay, you must have to remember the most important concept here. The metabolites are breaking down from complex to simpler ones. Okay, so this kind of reaction is commonly called catabolic reaction. When the molecules are breaking from complex to simpler ones, this kind of reaction is commonly called what? Catabolic reaction. And this catabolic or catabolism reactions, as we studied in the biomolecules only, you just remember that. So here the respiration process is what? Actual respiration process is what? A catabolic process. Okay, but when the body needs any metabolites, when the body needs any metabolites, the respiratory pathway suddenly undergoes a one more important process, that is called synthesis process, or you can also call it as an anabolic process. I mean, this is about what? A catabolic reaction, because it always breaking down the complex food into simpler ones. Okay, you know about this. But when the body needs a sudden metabolites, body starts to synthesize without any food molecules and all. Body starts to synthesize the metabolites with the help of a process that is called anabolic. Okay, when the body needs a fatty acids or proteins, whatever, for this reaction, acetyl coenzyme A will withdrawn from the respiratory pathway. What I said here, acetyl coenzyme A withdrawn from the respiratory pathway and starts to synthesize to fats, or starts to synthesize amino acids then into proteins. Okay, you may get confusion here. The metabolites are always getting from where? Our daily diet or daily nutrients, but some metabolites may not be present in our diet, and those metabolites should have to be prepared by the body itself. Hence why at that kind of metabolites the body need to synthesize, or the respiratory process need to synthesize those kinds of metabolites to the body. At that condition, acetyl coenzyme A will withdrawn from the respiratory pathway. Then this pyruvic acid starts to synthesize fats as well as proteins instead of continuation of breaking down. Okay, what it happens here? The acetyl coenzyme A starts to synthesize fats and starts to synthesize proteins. So when the process of respiration starts to synthesize a metabolite from simpler to complex, this kind of reaction is commonly called what? Anabolism. So hence why here the respiration process involves both catabolism as well as anabolism. Hence why it is called what? Amphibolic pathway. So this is about amphibolic pathway.